elements, for example, for questions and answers, or if there's anything in the comments. But welcome, everybody. So excited everybody could be here today. Hopefully the volume is good and everybody can see me and my COVID hair. Today we're going to be talking about disability inclusion in advertising and how to make sure that we can definitely make diversity, equity, and inclusion and disability a part of conversations, strategy, and creative. First, before we dive into the presentation though, I do want to have a survey. If everybody could just take a couple of seconds. And the question asked is, do you have a disability or do you know someone that has a disability? I'm going to go ahead and answer, and hopefully everybody who's participating right now, just take a few seconds. And again, we appreciate everybody attending today. Ryan, let's see if we have an answer.
We are getting there.
All right.
Let's give it a few more seconds.
That sounds good. The presentation hopefully should be enlightening and informative. And of course, after this presentation, it will be recorded for everyone to view at a later time, and transcripts will be provided. That's pretty significant. 73% of people who are participating in this webinar have shared that either they have a disability or someone they know has a disability. And that rings true, and we'll speak a little bit more to that in the presentation as to the overall population of people with disabilities. But that's definitely not a niche minority audience. That's a huge group who's participating today. So it sounds like there's probably a lot of advocates and allies as part of this webinar. So thanks for attending. Now, just to dive into the presentation, you want to click that or you want me to?
Okay, go ahead.
All right. So first I want to say that this presentation has captioning provided by VITAC. VITAC is one of the nation's largest providers of audio captioning, audio descriptions, and full-length information and content provided from presentations similar to this. There's a link that you should see at the top of your webinar screen to be able to click to allow for that captioning to be available. And if anybody has questions throughout the presentation, feel free to ask them in the chat feature. As well, the webinar allows for some personalization, so you're welcome to move, for example, if you see myself and Ryan on screen, you can move that to be able to have a different view of the slide presentation, which is also part of this. And as well, you can expand or contract the chat feature. So hopefully this allows for everybody to engage this presentation as effectively and optimally as possible. But if you do, again, have questions or comments, feel free to share them throughout the presentation. Just a little bit more about me. Hopefully you've seen that this presentation is from Designsensory. I'm Director of Strategy at Designsensory and also Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Specialist. Designsensory is a full-service advertising agency headquartered in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we provide a breadth and depth of a variety of advertising and communications. And my focus, again, is disability and diversity, equity, and inclusion. You'll see on this slide a couple of different things. A very blurry birth certificate from 1973, and really that's truthfully where my story got started, and my disability story as well. I was born in 1973 prematurely, 3 months premature to be exact. I only weighed 2.5 pounds, and the doctors said to basically not name me. My parents said to heck with that, and they gave me the strongest name that they thought was there, Joshua Bernard Zachary Loebner. Which has stuck with me, and I survived and grew. But at the time of my birth, I was in an incubator for 3 months, and at the time, medical technology wasn't what it is today. I was blind in my left eye from birth and had low vision in my right eye. You'll see another picture there from when I was 9 years old. I had glaucoma when I was 9 and had my left eye removed. And so now I'm fully blind in my left eye, and am legally blind in my right. But beyond my disability, I definitely try to bring a voice and visibility to disability inclusion in communications and advertising. And happy to be a contributing writer to Adweek, on the Mosaic Council, part of the American Advertising Federation. Along with all of that, I am earning a PhD, one of the first focused on advertising and disability inclusion. First, I do want to say that Black Lives Matter, and on this slide you see a mural of George Floyd and a halo surrounding him, and in that halo is inscribed the names of people who also have passed away in some shape or form connected to the Black Lives Matter movement or were advocates and allies for that. And so from a branding perspective, there have been significant and dynamic changes directly after the significant incidents that had taken place with the death of George Floyd, where brands weren't going to be able to stand aside, but rather make changes, whether it's Aunt Jemima totally rebranding or other well-known household items like cream of wheat or Uncle Ben's, seeing that their imagery, icons and names needed to be shifted. NASCAR said no more to the rebel flag on their racetracks. Mississippi is reimagining and reinterpreting what their flag looks like to no longer have that symbol of hate. The Dixie Chicks changed their name. The Washington Redskins, of course, have changed their name now. And so with all of this moving so rapidly and brands taking significant action, a question to be asked is, where do people with disabilities belong in all of that change? Well, advertising definitely is taking strides moving forward. On this slide are several images, one of a jockey ad that shows someone with amputee prosthetic legs in an ad. Chick-fil-A, where there was a TV commercial where both a customer and a staff member at Chick-fil-A were speaking in American Sign Language. Maltesers in 2016 launched an amazing internationally recognized campaign that incorporated people with disabilities. And there are so many others. Microsoft Xbox, for one, that has adaptive controllers that incorporated a young man who was interested in gaming. And through this device allowed to be able to experience it with his friends. All of these are amazing and positive shifts happening from a creative standpoint. There are also some challenges you'll see on this slide as well at the lower left. The MDA telethon, which has now just been reintroduced. I think a lot of people may be familiar, if you're old enough, to remember the Jerry Lewis telethon. For many people with disabilities, that long form ad, it was basically an infomercial, really was disparaging and not providing a positive life for people with disability. It focused on a lot of tropes and pejoratives, or a negative light of what people with disability really, it was misrepresenting so many in the disability community. And so, to that point, some are very disheartened to see that the MDA telethon is back. Now, I'm not going to dive into too much of a creative exploration in this presentation, but rather the pathway towards better inclusivity and creativity. But I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the creative pendulum. If you think of creativity in this swing of a pendulum, where potentially on each side of the pendulum there are negatives. For example, pity, we don't want that in the disability community. Or othering, where people with disability are singled out and siloed. Or infantilism, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Or the superscript, these are things we don't want. On the other side of the pendulum, from a creative standpoint as well, there are also challenges where there's total erasure, where people with disability just aren't incorporated into creative or communications or advertising because brands and marketers and agencies may not know what to do, and so they just don't do anything. Or inspiration porn, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Or pandering to the disability community. These are things that we don't want, and what I'll say as well is these are things that no other minority group wants, but rather simply that central point of the pendulum that's inclusivity from a positive portrayal and representation. Hopefully everybody is following along, just making sure, Ryan, there aren't any comments for any technological issues.
Not so far, and I do want to let everybody know that I'm going to turn on our Q&A mode right now. The chat window will have a Q&A section. If you have a specific question for Josh and I to address as it comes up, just go ahead and ask it. And towards the end, Josh and I will have a section where we'll read through some of these questions and we'll answer any questions you might have. But that's open now. So if you have questions that you want to make sure that Josh and I see and attempt to address, you can add those as well.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Sure.
So one thing to consider, there's a term called virtue signaling. And as an example, for example, virtue signaling is really a thin veneer of representation or allyship towards minority groups. And one consideration might be, we're all very familiar with the rainbow flag that represents Pride Month and the celebration of the LGBTQ community. And oftentimes brands that want to show their positivity and affinity towards that support of that minority group will change their social media icons to the rainbow flag. But the question to ask is that all those brands do to be able to engender positive affinity for the LGBTQ community? And really, if that's all they do, then that's not a lot. There could be so much more breadth and depth to recognition and connectivity towards that minority group. And so virtue signaling is something that we don't want. We don't want just that thin veneer of, well, we showed somebody in a wheelchair in a photo in a brochure 5 years ago. So doesn't that mean that we are accepting and inclusive of people with disabilities? And I would say, no, there's a lot more. And we're going to talk about that in just a few more minutes. Let's just take a quick second and talk about some definitions to better anchor everybody who may not understand the disability community in the largest and most holistic way. But disability impacts all of us. As we saw, 75 roughly % of the people participating today are in some way connected to disability. And the Centers for Disease Control, the US Census all agree that disability does impact us all, and that 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. In particular, just to let you know, Designsensory is headquartered in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in the Southeast, there's more of a propensity for the majority of the population to have disabilities than any other place in the country. And disability can be defined in any number of perspectives, from an invisible disability, where, for example, somebody may have a neurodiverse disability, such as autism, and outwardly they may not appear to be disabled. In fact, I have an invisible disability. I can, for the most part, only see blurriness on my screen right now, and whenever I meet people or individuals or speak at groups, I can't really see anybody. But outwardly, if I don't have my white cane with me, then I look just like probably I could see 20/20, but that's not the case. So there's invisible disabilities, and of course there's visible disabilities, somebody who may be, for example, in a wheelchair, or somebody who uses a cane, or other disabilities such as that. So 1 in 4 people has a disability, but the challenge is when it comes to advertising and, from a larger standpoint, media and entertainment more broadly, there are very few people with disability that are seen and portrayed. And so it makes it appear that this is actually a smaller group than it is. And advertising is a powerful tool. Advertising is very unique from a media standpoint, but in particular, advertising helps to shape our reality, helping us determine, what we either like or dislike from a brand, what affinities we have, what loyalties and allegiances we have, what we want to advocate for, and what we want to be an ally with. And that also connects back with people, and we can see how advertising over the past century has helped to welcome more inclusivity for different minority groups, whether it's people of color, Latinx, LGBTQ community, and now hopefully more often people with disabilities. Another consideration for the disability community is that it's one of the few minority groups that is open. And as everyone ages, more often than not, many of us will eventually have a disability if we don't already have one. And so it's a consideration to recognize that disability does in fact impact a significant majority of the population, or will, and that we all need to factor in how it can be better incorporated into advertising, marketing, and communications. So I'm going to walk through a few do's and don'ts. Language changes and shifts. And language, of course, is important to everyone in advertising and marketing, whether it's the name of a brand, a tagline, or those words that move us to action in a creative campaign. On the screen, you should see a slide that has on one side on the left a white background with just words: handicapped, crippled, handicapable, differently abled, and so on. And on the right, you should see a photo, a young man in a wheelchair, and in front of him is a word block that says disability. So on the right, with the photo in the background, those are the words that, from a language standpoint, have evolved to be positive and the ones that we want. And on the left, we don't want to use those in either a creative way or a connective way in describing people with disabilities. Disability is a word that many in the disability community are happy to be anchored to and reference. What I will say, though, is I don't want to in any way say that these are must-haves or that you need to emphatically say the word disability. That there are certain people and individuals that want to use different words, and to that I say, let them share how they want to be interpreted from a language standpoint. There's a medical model and a social model, not only of disability, but of every minority group, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, Latinx, the LGBTQ community. We understand that, of course, with every human, there's a medical model, but from the disability standpoint, we want to move more towards the social model, that I am part of a larger minority group that wants to have a voice and visibility and be heard from a societal and from a communication standpoint. People with disabilities aren't one-dimensional. I am not only framed by my blindness, it is a part of me, but there's also an intersectionality, and that can be layered on across multiple minorities. For example, the image here, which is from a Honey Maid commercial from the agency Droga5, shows a person of color who's a veteran, who's a double amputee below the knee, and he actually also enjoys Honey Maid graham crackers. Ableism versus equity. Ableism really is that that consideration where societally, oftentimes, many people who do not have a disability look down on those that do. And that's something that we don't want. We don't want that pity card when it comes to creativity, but rather we want equity, either when it comes to creativity and portrayals of people with disability or representation in an agency. For example, to not only be somebody in a mailroom, but also hopefully somebody at a higher director level or up. And this image, again, is from the Microsoft commercial that shows a young man playing video games, and he has an equitable opportunity to play those games just like any of his friends. Inspiration porn versus allyship. Inspiration porn is what we don't want. Inspiration porn is a vacant or vapid inspiration where somebody who's able-bodied may see somebody with a disability and actually feel better about themselves as an able-bodied person because they're not disabled. We don't want that. We want solidarity and allyship so that hopefully there can be camaraderie and cross-collaborative culture between people who have abilities and people who have disabilities. Infantilism versus adulting. We do not want infantilism. People who, for example, are in wheelchairs oftentimes may convey that sometimes people, even though this individual in a wheelchair may be an adult, might get patted on the head, or a little person may be seen while they're an adult as childlike. And oftentimes from a creative portrayal in advertising, what has been done in the past has skewed more towards infantilism and patronizing. But people with disabilities are adults and do adulting things and drink beer and enjoy spirits and enjoy adult relationships, as was shown in this Maltesers commercial from 2016. And that's a positive thing. Supercrip versus social normalization. A supercrip is what we don't want. We don't want every 4 years when the Paralympics comes around, or every 5 years as it is now. We don't want brands or advertisers to only scratch their heads and think, wow, the Paralympics are here. Maybe we should feature somebody with a disability in our ad. In fact, disability, again, is normal. 75% of the people in this webinar have a disability or are connected to somebody with a disability. My disability doesn't go away and come back every 4 years. And so how can advertisers and agencies think about social normalization and welcoming disability just basically every single day. This is from an Apple ad. This photo of a man in a wheelchair using Apple's voice control for the computer access. And disability friendly versus disability facts, again, is something friendly we don't want. What does disability friendly mean, especially for brands like Uber or ride shares or hotels or destinations or any place where somebody with a disability might need, for example, at a restaurant to know that there's an accessible stall or that the doorway allows for people in wheelchairs to be able to get in based on, let's say, a ramp or other accessibility feature. Disability facts are critical, so ensure that from a communication standpoint, you can be as refined and informative as possible within your marketing and communications. Second class versus citizen, that's pretty much self-explanatory. I have rights just like anybody else, but ultimately for so many years, people with disabilities were not seen as citizens, but rather second class. The photo here is from a Black Lives Matter commercial featuring deaf people that was titled Unspeakable. Now let's talk about inaccessibility to belonging. On this slide, you'll see an image of a person from the late 1800s with a lanyard around their neck that says blind. Well, for so long in our country, disability didn't belong here or anywhere. People with disabilities were ostracized. They were set apart. They were in basements. They were in back rooms. They were institutionalized and hospitalized in ways that no one wanted to see anybody with a disability. And so there's this societal scar of being embarrassed or ashamed of being somebody with a disability. We can all think of other minority groups who at one time were persecuted or shamed for being who they were. But now those people in advertising, communications, and entertainment hopefully are celebrated, are lauded, or are lifted up. And the same is what we want for disability. This image is from a book cover called The Ugly Laws, where municipalities all across the country would fine people and their families if people with disabilities were seen in public. Or beyond fining, they would arrest people with disabilities. And disappointingly enough, some of those laws were still on the books until the 1970s. But there has been momentum for rights. Again, oftentimes people with disabilities are seen as the quiet minority group, the group that just goes along with some of the challenges that are in place and just accepts them. But actually, people with disabilities have been protesting along others for many, many years. In 1977, the largest sit-in occupation of a federal building was done by people with disabilities to hopefully move forward with accessibility rights. People with disabilities have marched in disability pride parades. This was a pride parade in the late 1980s, and the banner here says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," from Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Prior to that watershed legislation, though, this image shows a portrayal of people with disabilities on Capitol Hill, where to be able to be seen by legislators, lobbyists, and others on Capitol Hill, they literally turned their wheelchair sideways and crawled up the steps on Capitol Hill to be noticed, to be able to have a voice, to shift the momentum for that paradigm shift of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So how does that connect now to popular culture? And what I'll say is significant and important, and right now I'm just sharing images of toys. This is Barbie in a wheelchair, also an image of Barbie with a prosthetic leg and different body shapes and sizes. These are Lego bricks that are teaching young children Braille. This is an Uno card with Braille on it. And this is the 2020 American Girl doll who was deaf. Why is all that important? Well, first, these are brands that recognize disability is important well beyond just creative advertising and broadly marketing, to more deeply incorporating accessibility and disability representation into their products and celebrating those as a central component of their brand. But more importantly, the consideration is, where does the disability conversation begin? I couldn't be more thrilled for so many people to be watching this webinar right now, but we're all, I'm assuming for the most part, adults in the professional world. And for some, potentially, this may be one of the first conversations that to be had when it comes to disability inclusion in advertising and marketing. But hopefully we can recognize that these toys show that disability can start, and the DE and I conversation can start so young, literally at a toddler's age, to welcome diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, disability is, from a pop culture standpoint, incorporated in emojis, where we can share with other people in our texts of how disability is gaining more visibility and voice. At last year's Sundance Film Festival, Crip Camp was the celebrated film, the one that was most celebrated by the entire film industry. And the film, which can be seen on Netflix, is a trajectory of disability rights and how it started at a camp near Woodstock in the late 60s. And going back to the infantilism versus adulting, again, oftentimes people with disabilities are seen as needing so much help or needing something more than a typical adult would. And here, Molly Burke, she's an author, she's a YouTube influencer. Habeen Gurma is the first graduate who's deafblind from Harvard Law School. So people with disabilities definitely are making strides and advocating for themselves in media and marketing. So how does this all tie into the larger conversation of compliance versus commitment? Accessibility is a big word, and lots of times brands definitely want to be able to check that box off and say, I'm accessible when it comes to the disability community. But what I want everybody to understand who are participating today is that accessibility is a word that shouldn't just be anchored to the disability community and isn't the only thing to consider when it comes to inclusivity with regards to people with disabilities. Accessibility, of course, was an issue with people of color. We can all remember or know from history books the civil rights era, where there was separate but equal whites only buildings and places where people of color were designated. There were accessibility issues for people of color at that time. Those issues, to an extent, have been resolved. We know there are so many more. But that accessibility, while it has been solved, we know that there needs to be more done with that minority group. With the LGBTQ community, there was an accessibility issue when it came to equitable marriage and marriage rights. That's been solved. That law has been passed, but that is not the only accessibility issue, or more broadly, the only issue when it comes to that community. The same is true for women when it comes to accessibility and breaking the glass ceiling. That's not the only issue. It has been solved in some instances, but it can grow. And for any other minority group, we know that accessibility is only one point. So for the disability community, for those who came to this presentation and want to know more about making their website accessible, we'll dive in a little bit, but understand that that is only one point of something larger, of ensuring that accessibility is part of a larger initiative towards inclusivity of people with disabilities. But what I do want to say is, on this slide, you'll see an image of Domino's. Domino's Pizza fought all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that their website didn't have to be made accessible. And this wasn't something that happened in the 1970s or 1980s. This was just this past year. So there are brands, there are advertisers, there are industry organizations that actually supported Domino's to be able to fight to not have their website accessible. And that's a challenge. And can you only imagine if Domino's didn't allow another minority group, if Domino's said, you know what, we don't allow people of color onto our website. We don't allow Latinx or women onto our website. How did that pivot in your mind and see that really it makes no sense that they wanted to fight to be able to ensure that their website didn't have to be accessible? But again, when it comes to accessibility, there can be a larger consideration, and we like to frame it from an ideas standpoint. And ideas stands for inclusive, diverse, equitable, accessible successes. Just to touch on a few of these, if you're asking yourself, what's that first thing I need to do to be able to be more inclusive from a disability framing perspective? The first thing to do is say, look, I'm moving beyond this webinar to making that pledge. Make a pledge to be more inclusive. And hopefully that pledge isn't just a thin pledge where you forget about it the next day, but how can you take that pledge and be able to weave in disability inclusion into your strategic plan for either the remainder of 2020 or what's coming up in 2021? How can you be more diverse? What are some ways that you can connect with people with disability? If you look around at your business and don't see very many people with disabilities where you're employed, how can you connect with people with disability in the community? Every university has a disability student services group. Every community, or the majority of communities, if they're large enough, typically have an Americans with Disabilities Act manager or officer that works for the city or municipality. And those are individuals to connect with. In Knoxville, Tennessee, we have the Tennessee School for the Deaf, or one of its satellite schools located here in our community. I serve on the Mayor's Council for Disability Issues here in Knoxville. So there are many different ways that you can connect with and have an affinity with different disability groups or individuals in the community. And how can you be equitable? On this slide, I share some different interpretations of disability inclusion. Of course, at Designsensory, we make sure that accessibility is a central component to the majority, if not all, of our initiatives, and also look at different ways that more broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion can be incorporated into advertising, campaigns, and creative. But as well, different organizations, the American Advertising Federation has the Mosaic Council that tries to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of the industry initiatives moving forward. MAPE stands for Minority Advertising Intern Program, and that's through the 4As. So, and then as well, the disability collection, if right now sometimes photographing new creative could be a challenge, the disability collection is through Getty Images in collaboration with Verizon, where those are best practices, portrayals, and representations of people with disabilities in stock photography. And then, of course, yes, accessibility. We do want websites to be accessible. So make sure that your website is accessible, but then take a quick step back. There is a larger digital ecosystem that needs to be considered. Can your social media be more accessible? Can your advertising be more accessible? And just a few quick tips on accessibility for a website. You want to ensure that you have live text on your website so that a screen reader can read it. If you have images or video on your website, you want alt tags, you want descriptions, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. But really another first step or second step after you take that pledge and you look at your strategic plan is to perform an audit. What are some different ways that you can be able to parse through the various components of your campaign? Is your website accessible? Is your social media accessible? But then how can you better incorporate disability representation and more broadly diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are some different things that you can do to ensure that your advertising is putting its best foot forward for inclusivity? And that's where an audit happens to really, again, start that ball rolling and start that momentum of understanding not only where you are and what gaps you have, but how those can be bridged. And advertisers benefit from things like captioning. Here we see some stats that on mobile devices, advertising actually performs better through captioning, open captioning. And again, these are a couple of different accessibility initiatives. Audio descriptions support engagement. Open captions help people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Audio descriptions help people who are blind or have low vision. And those are where one could audibly hear not only a narrator or on-screen talent, but also a description of the larger scene that's taking place. And then ultimately, we felt that it was significant and important to not end the acronym, the reinterpretation of DEI into idea, but rather ideas, because success is critical when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in particular disability. Make sure that if you are conducting any research, that disability is part of that research and insights analysis to know that not only from a demographic standpoint, but also from a psychographic standpoint, how disability can positively impact your advertising. Here we see some statistics from Google that at a broad level show the validity and value of diversity, equity, and inclusion in advertising. And finally, I do want to say that there's a phrase in the disability community that could be shared with any minority group: nothing about us without us. What that means is pretty self-explanatory. If you are developing creative, if you are looking at your website to be more inclusive and accessible, or more broadly, other marketing initiatives, how can you ensure that somebody or a group of people are part of those conversations from the beginning? Don't wait until you've already developed the creative brief, you've decided on talent, and you're on the shoot day and you kind of scratch your head and think, wow, we need diverse representation. Start those conversations early on and make sure that even if you're not dedicated towards hiring people with disabilities, that you can have a larger ideas council in the community to help move things forward. I'll leave everybody with this. Accessibility is being able to get into a building. Diversity is getting invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table. And belonging is having your voice heard at the table. And we want that belonging for the disability community. Real quick, just a couple of other things. If you enjoyed this presentation and you want to dive in more, again, I shared that I'm a contributing writer to Adweek. Adweek is having the first ever Disability Inclusion Summit on September 30th. We've got some amazing people who are a part of it, from the Disability In organization to Walmart to BBDO to Wunderman Thompson and others. Please join us for that. And as well, Designsensory is proud to launch today the Explorable podcast, which is about travel, disability, and inclusion. And I'm joined by my co-host, Toby Willis from the Expedia Group, where we connect with people with disability and others who are advocates and allies in the travel category. With that, you can connect with me. I'm at Josh Loebner on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. And Ryan, are there any questions?
We can give this as an opportunity for folks to start populating questions if they have any. You can just go right into that Q&A mode tab on the chat window, and you can type any questions that you might have right there. We'll give just a little bit of time for folks to populate those if they want.
And what I will say, sometimes, questions when it comes to minority representation, and in particular disability, if this is one of the first times that you've been a part of the conversation, sometimes questions may be tricky, or you may find it difficult to ask in a larger group. So I'm definitely available for one-on-one conversations to be able to help you understand where you are, either as a brand or an ad agency or a marketer, to move from exclusion to inclusion, or to find out where you are on that journey. Everybody's at a different place when it comes to the journey of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there's no shame in where you are, whether it's at the beginning or you're an advocate and an ally. It's something that we all recognize we need to do better at on a regular basis. So welcome questions now or again at a later time.
We've got a few folks starting to let us know some things. Susan let us know that she's a T10 paraplegic. She's a full-time wheelchair user. So Susan, we're really thrilled that you were able to join us today. That's great that you were able to be a part of this and hear from Josh.
Yeah, thanks so much, Susan. It's wonderful that you're participating. Oftentimes, events such as these really, while it can be disappointing that it's virtual, it's also an amazing opportunity for so many people who are a part of this webinar to not have to physically be in one place, but to be able to connect from so many different locations.
So Susan also let us know that she's running for office. And she wants to represent herself in her wheelchair as she is, and just wants to know, Josh, if you have any ideas for how to publicly portray herself as a person with a disability.
Well, congratulations for your running on the ballot. We wish you luck for that. But really, it's how you want to feel interpreted in the best light. You want to be able to be an advocate for yourself. So if you have a professional photographer or just a friend taking photos, make sure that you can be conveyed in the best light, and don't be dictated to, but rather be a part of that conversation. Selfies are wonderful, but again, if you have a professional photographer, the one thing to consider is you want that photographer to take pictures of you so that they are at your level, not looking from above. And if you want some inspiration on some professional photography, feel free to look at Senator Tammy Duckworth's visual imagery and videos. Of course, she's a senator who is a veteran, was a helicopter pilot, one of the first women to serve, and have a disability from combat, and she is in a wheelchair.
Okay. James says that his company is getting ready to celebrate Disability Awareness Month in October, and he wants to know, he's got a two-part question. First, he wants to know, what are some ways that companies tend to misstep during Disability Awareness Month? And also, is there a way that we recommend finding panelists and speakers for events like that?
James, what a great question. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And what I would suggest is that, number one, a misstep is to not recognize it and to not celebrate it. Again, there are so many other months that we're very familiar with broadly as a society: Black History Month, Pride Month, but National Disability Employment Awareness Month, it's a little bit less visible. So for you to say that you want to celebrate it, that's great. Some ways to definitely do that is locally. Again, if you have a college, does that college have a disability student services group, or young people who have disabilities who are advocates for themselves and want to be a voice? So consider them from an internship standpoint. It'd be great for the month of October to recognize not only the month for full employment, but also to get people excited about advertising and into this industry. And lots of times people with disabilities don't see it as open to an industry for them. So connect with your local college. Also, again, if there is an Americans with Disabilities Act officer or manager at the municipal level, invite them. And then simply ask around as well. Are there other organizations or groups in the community that are allies of disability, and if they could be part of a panel?
James also had a question about as they work to do more events that are focused on accessibility. Do we have recommendations for software or resources that help get us to a place where we can have closed captioning?
Yeah, and so that's definitely a topic to consider, as we're all, or the majority of us, are virtual right now. How can we ensure in the creative process, if we engage in meetings virtually beyond webinars such as this, how inclusion can be a part of it? So a couple of things: make sure that there is a microphone so that people can audibly hear well, but secondarily, captioning. As I said earlier, this presentation has captioning provided by VITAC. They are an organization that provides captioning, transcripts, etc. But as well, there are a number of other organizations and groups and individuals that can support in that capacity. So just make sure whatever software platform you use, it has captioning as well. You could use software to be able to audit your website from an accessibility standpoint. And there are a number of different softwares out there. Accessibility is an organization. AXE is another that allows for software interpretation. But I always like to say that that's only one side of the coin when it comes to monitoring a website for accessibility, that there needs to be a human component to not only see the technological aspects of accessibility, but also the human and heuristic side of interpretation of disability inclusion and representation.
And Josh, a really great question that Luke had about invisible disabilities. He wants to know, what about the more cognitive or more invisible disabilities? How do we portray this in a way that removes the stigma of mental health, cognitive or intellectual disabilities?
And that has been a challenge for advertisers to an extent, where representation from a portrayal standpoint within creative has struggled a little bit. There have been some brands, Northwestern Mutual Insurance recently incorporated a young man with autism into one of their ads. Apple as well has several times incorporated autism as a topic into their advertising, as well as positive portrayals. But really, there are any number of ways. It starts again with that creative concept to say, what are we doing? How can we include people, whether they have invisible disabilities or visible disabilities, and ensure that that representation is there either visually within portrayals in photo or video, or audibly, or textually, to ensure that as many people with disabilities are represented.
Sure. And Charlotte had a question. If we could just go over again the software that we just mentioned, if we could spell it out maybe.
Sure, definitely. So there's a software platform called AXE. And if you just typed into your browser AXE accessible software, that should come up, and you'll find a depth of information on that. And then if you simply just typed in website accessibility to your browser, you're going to find a litany of different software providers. There's not just one or two, and there's agencies such as ours that can perform accessibility audits and recommendations for not only websites, but more broadly, your entire comprehensive integrated campaign. So it's something that you can find any number of different options out there, again, from something that's as simple as software to a more holistic approach to accessibility and inclusivity that is an agency perspective.
And Charlotte, just to go back to what we're using today for open captioning, we're using a service called VITAC, which is VITAC, and they are providing live open captioning for our webinar today. And some webinar platforms they can interface directly with, some they have external windows, but that's who we're using today to provide open captioning. We have a few more people that are still working on some questions here, it looks like.
Okay. Yeah, we appreciate all these questions, and they can run the gamut from something simple to something more complex. So if we don't answer your question fully, feel free to reach back out. We're happy to jump on the phone, or again, a video conference, to dive a little deeper to explore what are some of the challenges, or you just need a little bit more insight into some answers that you're seeking.
I think we've got a question coming in from Kristen.
Mm-hmm. And we appreciate everybody staying on and asking these questions. It shows that you care about the subject, and that you definitely want to learn more about how you can improve, or what are some advancements towards inclusivity of people with disabilities.
Yeah, and Susan had a question about whether or not we'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar. We absolutely will. As soon as this webinar is over, we'll follow up with an email that will give you not only a recording of this presentation, but you'll also get an insights paper that Josh wrote. Josh, do you want to give them just a brief synopsis of what that insights paper is about?
Sure, definitely. So this was a broad strokes webinar, but if you want to dive in deeper and have a little bit more depth of data, there's a corresponding document that we provide, a white paper, that will allow you to have more statistics, data, and insights to be able to share either with your employee colleagues or others to help advance momentum towards greater inclusion of people with disabilities, and more broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And E. Henderson had a question about, do you know the source of the data on the slide with the Google data about accessibility and inclusion metrics?
Yes. So if you do find the link, which will be provided to you, of the white paper, and the white paper has all of the information for the resources incorporated in it. And that is one of the data points that was brought into this webinar.
And Kristen has a great question. She says, I work in the nonprofit sector as an ally. Are you able to provide additional educational and informative resources for our interns and volunteers who may not be as familiar resources we trust versus just a general Google search, instead of having to sort through all of the various things that are out there. What are some sort of go-to great information sources that you trust?
Yeah, so there are a number of different organizations. Disability In, which is the word disability, and in.org. DisabilityIn.org is a national nonprofit that connects with businesses and nonprofits to be able to share allyship information, best practices for businesses to hopefully move forward down the path of greater inclusivity. So that is definitely one organization that I would recommend as a first step towards connecting with more inclusivity. And then, of course, individuals and agencies like Designsensory. We help a number of different nonprofits locally and beyond to ensure, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion in communications and creative.
And it looks like for now that is the end of our questions. I'm really thankful that everybody was able to attend today and we were able to have this great conversation.
Thanks so much, everybody. And again, feel free to reach out. Hopefully the white paper and webinar recording are also valuable, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.